Our next speaker is Professor Simon Collinson. He is from the University of Birmingham School of Business. He, in particular, has been appointed the Dean of the Birmingham Business School and a Professor of International Business there as of 2012. He's a member of several UK business councils and sits on the management board overseeing the UK Small Business Charter. Of particular relevance in his presentation today, he was a founding director of the Simplicity Partnership, hence my interest, of course, in reaching out to him. Simon's research has focused on international business, innovation, complexity, and China. His most recent book, From Complexity to Simplicity, was shortlisted in 2014 for the Chartered Management Institute Business Book of the Year. So please join me in welcoming Simon.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, and a big thank you to Alan and Irene and Siegelvision, who've really shown the way with the Simplification project. I appreciate the invitation to come and speak, and it's wonderful to be here in New York. I'm going to start with three, I think, fairly obvious points. The first is that organizations are inherently complex, and the problem is us. So people are the issue, people are the problem. The good news is you're also part of the solution. So in some ways, I want you to take this talk personally. You've got to take some of the responsibility for bringing in some of the complex things that most managers, most employees that I'm going to talk about complain about. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that some complexity adds value, and some doesn't. So this isn't a question of getting rid of all complexity. Complex processes, technologies, ways of doing things, behaviors underpin competitive advantage. They underpin how we do things well. The trick is differentiating that from the stuff that doesn't add value. And that's not easy, but I'm going to talk about how we've looked into this. Third thing is that this is of interest to all kinds of organizations. I'm going to talk about profit makers. I'm going to talk about big corporations. This is of interest to the non-profits, to the charity sector, the third sector. They add value too. And if you add value in terms of social welfare, improving the well-being of society and people, efficiently adding value, using the resources and the people and the time you have as an input, and doing that well, it's equally as important. And I'll focus on the profits in this talk, but some of the stuff we found through the research in differentiating bad complexity from good complexity applies to all kinds of organizations. So keep that in mind. That's pretty obvious stuff. Not so obvious. 3 points. Where? How? In what ways does complexity get in the way of our adding value? Secondly, how much value is destroyed by what I call bad complexity? Can you put a number on it? Thirdly, and this is kind of a principle for life more generally, I think, how do we get rid of the bad stuff and keep the good stuff? It's as simple as that. But again, you've got to take some responsibility for this. You're leaders in your fields, and you taking a lead on, first, the differentiation, secondly, getting out the bad stuff. Some of it's inertia, as Christina was saying. It's old processes. It's embedded ways of doing things that don't help anybody. We've got to differentiate the two and get rid of the bad. So here's my agenda. I'm going to start with a definition. I think it's important for you to understand what we define business complexity as, because that gives an insight into findings I'm going to tell you about from a large-scale study we did, which came up with the Global Simplicity Index, which I'll tell you about, which correlates certain types of complexity with performance, and then differentiates firms in terms of those who seem to cope well with certain types of complexity and therefore perform well, and those that are struggling. They're over-complex, and their performance is indicating the kinds of problems they're having. And a lot of the big companies, a lot of the economists, the McKinseys, the Deloittes of this world have tried to look at this particular metric, but they haven't answered the questions I gave you just now. They haven't put a figure on this, and they haven't really taken steps to practical means of differentiating the bad from the good and getting rid of the bad. So I'll talk through that. So I'll talk through a quantitative study we did, and then I'll talk through a qualitative approach, a management survey. We looked at 600 managers, and since then we've grown it to well over 1,200 responses to a questionnaire that asked people not to just, what are you going to complain about in terms of complexity? What bothers you? We actually asked them how it is that certain complexity types affect their performance and their productivity on a day-to-day basis. Because everybody complains about their workplace. Everyone talks about how bad it is in certain organizations and how things get in their way. But we asked them to try and put a metric on the performance hit, the productivity hit they took as individuals from certain types of complexity. And that qualitative study, that deep dive into different kinds of organizations, I think has brought out some really interesting stuff about what you can do about it. And I'll come on to that at the end. Okay, definitions. And for those technically minded out there, if you're interested in the academic side of this, this comes from a pretty practical area of theory, which is complex adaptive systems theory. And what we do is we define complexity as increasing when number and variety of components in a system or organization increase, okay? So in a sense, those could be the people, it can be the processes, it can be the organizational practices, a whole range of things feature as components in these organizations. Complexity increases when you change the interrelationships between them, and complexity increases when you alter the pace at which these relationships and components interact. It takes a bit of getting that into your head, but effectively, it's quite an operationalizable definition of complexity within different kinds of organizations. Think about it this way. Aeroplanes are complicated because they're made up of a whole range of different components. But it's pretty predictable. When you change an input, change a lever, make it go up or down, it's pretty predictable what the outcome will be. Okay, so predictability is something that complicated systems manifest. Complexity is when different outputs come from the same inputs. Okay? We cannot really predict how a system is going to react to sometimes the same inputs, because these complex systems spiral out of anticipated control. And that, in a nutshell, is probably 30 or 40 books and several hundred papers on complex adaptive systems. And I'm not going to get into the academic stuff any more than that. But understanding that complexity is a component of all of these things is quite important. This leaves three challenges for any kind of organizations, whether you're a profit maker, whether you're a public sector company. The first is what I call the balancing act. You've kind of got to get the right number of components in different organizational contexts, different rules, processes, people, types of expertise, different forms of incentive. You've got to get the right number and the right type. If you get too many unnecessary components, you get the wrong kinds of incentives, the wrong kinds of processes, you've got an imbalance, and that's where complexity starts to take over and overwhelm your ability to cope with the interaction between the components. Okay? That's the first challenge. Second challenge I alluded to right at the very beginning. There are different kinds of complexity. Some of it underpins what you do well. The good stuff, product IP, your business model, your production processes, some of your people, the way that they're motivated to improve what they do on a daily basis, these are value-added forms of complexity. They're very complex, but they add value. They connect to the client experience, as we heard from Merrill Lynch, or they connect to the efficiency, the quality, the cost of your product. That's the good stuff. Got to keep the good stuff. Some of it is given. We heard from John Thiel right at the beginning, from Merrill Lynch. They are given a huge range of regulatory compliance procedures they have to follow. There's not much they can do about it. They lobby, clearly, but there's not much they can do about it. That's given. You've got to cope with the external sources of complexity you're given. You've got to manage it and cope with it. Then there's the bad stuff, and the bad stuff is the stuff we have to get rid of. And identifying it and differentiating it is the key issue. So that's the second challenge. Differentiate within your organization context between those three things and deal with them differently. The third challenge for all organizations is that it's a progressive problem. Just as Christina was saying, this is a lifetime journey. This never stops. Complexity is brought in because we create it. People are the source of it. We differentiate, we customize, we're creative. A lot of it adds value, quite a lot of it doesn't add value. It just makes things more complex. It doesn't add to the bottom line. So the third challenge for all companies, for all organizations, is this issue of making sure you keep a tab on sources of complexity, people behavior, how it creeps in, and try and stop it. Now this relates to the research I'm going to talk to you about now, because in a sense what we realized in the analysis we did is that companies evolve, and when they add products, they expand their portfolio, they move into new markets, they bring in new technologies, new people, performance goes up. This is good. All companies in all sectors reach a tipping point, and we think we've found some clues to where that tipping point comes in. After the tipping point, you add more people, you go into a new market, you expand your portfolio a little more. It doesn't add as much value as the added complexity and cost that it brings in. And if you don't know where that tipping point is, or you don't know the signs of the fact that you're evolving as an organization towards a point where adding new stuff is just not going to add to the bottom line, you've got a problem. Now, that's easy to say, but our research tried to explore precisely where the tipping point was and what the costs of going to the tipping point were for different kinds of companies. So I'm going to talk about the research in a minute, but in a sense that summarizes what I'm talking about. Complexity does a whole range of things. Actually, what comes out of our survey is it really harms motivation. People get very pissed off working in overcomplicated, very complex organizations, and it reduces their incentive to add value. Okay, so what did we do? A whole bunch of academics got onto this. We read a lot of stuff, a few theories. But we tried to find for the first time and quantify the impact of complexity on firm performance. I'm going to talk about the profits, as I say. We gathered, and this first survey was done over 5 years, 2005, 2011. Since 2011, we've supplemented and added new firms in, new data in to build this up. So the first study we did was a statistical analysis, and the second, further down, was a qualitative questionnaire-based survey. And we picked out what I call proxy measures. You'll have heard this term maybe. Representative measures of performance and complexity. 9 performance measures you'll be familiar with if you're from the business world were things like operating profit margin, profit per employee, earnings per share, EBITDA. Okay? Simple profit measures. And those 9 proxy measures of overall performance were then correlated with 9 proxy measures of complexity. And this was the tough bit. Boiling down hundreds of measures of different forms of complexity in different kinds of organizations to 9 available representative measures was really difficult. But we got those. One, for example, was multinationality. We use a transnational index because the more countries a firm is in, the more cultures it deals with, the more institutions and regulatory frameworks that it deals with, the more complex it is. That was one good representative measure. A second measure was product portfolio. 2 measures of product portfolio. One was diversification. How diverse are the things you do as an organization? Secondly, a concentration measure. What proportion of your revenues and profits comes from one product or service? Because if 90% comes from one thing, that's much simpler than having a whole range of products and services with a small amount of revenue coming from all of them. Okay, so diversification and your product portfolio was another measure of complexity. The frequency and value of mergers and acquisitions was another proxy measure of complexity. Firms that enter into M&A and joint ventures really get overwhelmed by trying to integrate different parts from different organizations into one thing. And then finally, one thing that came up earlier, and it was impressive to see John Thiel from Merrill Lynch talk about flattening his hierarchy of organization. Because we found that management layers, the breadth and depth of your hierarchy adds massive complexity. And some of that complexity comes in communication, bottom-up and top-down communication. Very challenging. So management hierarchy, the levels and the portfolio breadth of line management was another proxy measure. So what did we come up with? In the quantitative survey, this is what we found. This was done initially on the largest 200 firms in the world in the Fortune 500. And we took one measure in this particular graph, which is EBITDA, and we correlated that one measure with 9 proxy measures of complexity. And we found that overall, on average, the 200 biggest companies in the world are losing an estimated 10.2% of shareholder value. 1.2 billion EBITDA on average per firm is lost because of this bad complexity after the tipping point. Okay, that amounts to 237 billion lost across the 200 firms as a result of what we term value-destructive complexity. That's a huge amount of money. And if you don't want to turn it into money, okay, if you get rid of the bad complexity, you get rid of the processes and the things you're doing that aren't adding value, you can turn it into time. You can free up time for people. If you don't want to make more profits, if you can make yourselves more efficiently in this sense and don't go over the tipping point, you can translate that into time for yourself, time for your families, time for the things you like doing. So again, I want to steer away from just focusing on profit, but that measure showed a drop in profitability of that value. Now, the interesting thing here was that the tipping point varies immensely for different companies in different sectors of different sizes. Okay? That's just an average. And you really need to get deep dives into each of these organizations to understand what is the source of particularly value-destroying complexity in each kind of organization and how it manifests itself and how you get rid of it. So that was the finding, and we create a matrix from that. The matrix does this. It parcels up firms into 4 different categories. At one end, the simplifiers have low complexity and low profit. Okay? In your country, 2 companies in there, Kroger and Safeway, retailers. Very simple model, pretty slow moving. They might not think that, but relative to the other firms in these 200, that's the case. Low margins, not hugely profitable, but ticking away. They could actually add complexity, interestingly, in different ways, probably by internationalizing and make more money. They choose not to. But it wasn't a big category, the simplifiers. The second one is the performers. These are what you need to try and aspire to be. They make high profits, but they're relatively simple. I think Merrill Lynch was in this category. Goldman Sachs is certainly in that category, and Merrill Lynch wasn't, and John Thiel was still here. I kind of challenge him with that and ask him why they're not in the simple high profit margin. AT&T, ExxonMobil, Goldman Sachs, they're in the performer category. They are making good money. They're relatively low complexity on the metrics we've used. The complicators are at that tipping point, and they're about to go over. The complicators include Pfizer, Apple, intriguingly, Apple, GE, and IBM. IBM is one of the most complex companies in our metrics that we've ever come across. And it's at this point where if it slides further into diversification, internationalization, M&A, it's going to struggle to understand precisely what its simple added value is as a corporation. But they've survived that. They're one of the longest standing companies in the world, and they've survived that tipping point a number of times in the past. Hardware, well, first of all, mainframes to PCs, and then hardware to software. They've evolved. They've coped. But they are very much in the complicators category. Then finally, the low performance, high complexity companies, which were the strugglers in our terminology. Ford is in there. And a company based in Finland, very near our colleague here, Nokia, we identified some time ago being in that particular category. They got a 21% drop in their profits, 2009 to 2010, after we'd done our initial analysis. They were diversifying. They were getting into M&As. They were getting into digital. They were getting into gaming. They were getting a whole range of things they didn't know about, and overcomplicating precisely what it is they did. Let me move on and talk about our survey. So, you know, your quantitative analysis, it gives you a portfolio correlation between certain types of complexity and certain types of performance. We then wanted to get some insights into the reasons. What are the bad things? What is the bad types of complexity that different organizations are suffering from? And our qualitative questionnaire survey, initially was 600 managers, and then went up to 1,200 eventually. And again, I'll come back to this point. Everybody complains about their work. Everyone's got a problem. Everyone says, I work in a really complex organization. But we specifically asked these individuals what it was that impacted their productivity. What were the types of complexity that made them not add the value that they could add? And this is the top sort of 10 internal drivers of complexity. And what you see at the very bottom, the highest there on complexity impact score, is launching new stuff. Doing new stuff, new initiatives, expanding your portfolio, and the range and diversity of stuff that you sell and do is the #1 cause of added complexity. It can be positive, but in this sense, People were saying this is what was adding to their work days and preventing them from adding value because they were getting pulled in increasingly different directions in terms of what it was they were presenting to clients and customers. But there are three themes that come out of that sort of top 10 list. First is the diversity theme. Products, services, or customers, or markets. Doing new stuff creates tensions. And there is an optimum for different kinds of organizations, an optimum diversity of things you do. The second theme is levels of management, and John mentioned this right at the beginning. Levels of management, the way you're measured, the way you report, the reporting lines, complex decision making, the number of different stages you have to go through to get anything done, adds stress and adds complexity that distracts you from adding value or actually constrains you from adding value in the organization. And the third theme in our sort of top 10 is communication behaviors. And again, Alan's company has paved the way for understanding better how you clarify the message about strategy, about the prioritization of the daily activities within organizations. We found two really interesting types of people in all our organizations. There were those who really understood what the priorities were. They could connect with an end customer. Didn't matter where they were in the organization. They understood how they could add value in their day jobs. But they were distracted from doing it. They were constrained from doing it because things were in their way. Irrelevant procedures, reporting lines that meant nothing, IT systems that didn't work or were over complex, and they were distracted from doing the things they knew that would add value. But there was an equally large group of people within organizations that even if they had more time and more resources, kind of didn't know how what they did as a cog in the big wheel of the organization added value at the end of the day. They didn't realize. So if you take back office, you take IT, you take your HR, you take your finance team, they are sometimes so many stages behind the client, away from the customer. They really wouldn't know if you told them, I'm going to give you an extra day a week, or I'm going to give you an extra budget, $100,000. What would you do that would add value at the end? No idea. And that's a communication problem. That's a problem where actually clarity of purpose, prioritization of what you're doing, connecting how you work and how it adds value is key. And we found so many organizations were struggling with that particular issue. So we parceled up, let me just go back if I can. No, let me go with this one. I'll skip one and go with this one. This is just really a snapshot of some of the findings we got, just to give you an insight into the actual responses. And it was intriguing. When you look at specialist IT systems, 38% of the firms we looked at had 6 or more specialist IT systems to do the job. 13% of organizations have more than 16 different kinds of IT systems. Hopelessly chaotic within these kinds of companies. Budget planning takes 4 or more weeks of the year for 61% of the firms we surveyed, over 10 weeks for 15%, and for 10% of the companies, it takes 16 weeks to work out their budgets. And again, it comes back to Christina's point. By that time, the world's kind of moved on. You need to be doing slightly different things. 23% of our sample have more than 10 management levels in their organization. 19% have more than 16. This is about hierarchy and span of control. 19% have more than 16 management levels in their organizations. And then 31% of our survey had more than 6 stages to their capital expenditure sign-off process, and 7% have more than 16 stages of sign-off for CapEx. How many people making one decision on a bit of money? And are they all aligned, or are they just going to block or question or ask and send in the circular round-the-table discussion about stuff? Huge complexity underlying those symptoms. We found email, interestingly, wasn't in itself a form of or a type of complexity that got in people's way. It was a symptom of 101 other kinds of complexity. Those companies that had many layers of management, there were more emails going around. Everyone was checking their own back, basically. So 43% of our samples spend more than 10% of their time dealing with email. Think about yourselves. 16% of our respondents spent more than 30% of their time on their emails. And there was a strong correlation between the volume of emails people were spending time on and the performance of the company overall. It was symptomatic of a range of other complexity problems. let me wrap up then. I mean, in summary, because that's a lot of stuff I'm throwing at you. Understand that. We've done quite a lot of work on this, and we've researched it, trying to put a number on the performance complexity correlation. But in a sense, it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And again, I'll come back to you as individuals as part of the problem and part of the solution. But some of it is inevitable. Some of it you've got to accept. Some of the companies that were really high performers in very turbulent environments, consumer electronics, for example, digital, very turbulent environments, complexity getting thrown at them. Some of the best performers coped best with the given complexity, the stuff you can't do much about. If you're given complexity, if it's thrown at you, like compliance or regulation or new technologies, coping with it, having systems in place to monitor and track it and cope with it, that's where performance comes from. But actually, structural complexity is in the design of the organizations, and it comes back kind of finally, I think, to something Christina says. Our organizations are subject to huge levels of inertia, huge levels of embeddedness and processes we came across in our interviews and our study of people who've been doing stuff for a long time and kept doing it because it's the thing we do, without quite understanding how it fits in with the rest of the organizational structure and how it adds value. That inertia, that embeddedness is natural. It's a home to us. We understand the routine, we know what we're doing, we're comfortable there. But when those processes and those structures, those interrelationships, it's well beyond the time they add value in a changing world, it's time to get rid of them. And that's the tough thing. And I think you've got to have evidence like this if you're going to go into an organization and start sacking people, getting rid of divisions, shutting down processes, because people guard them, they're defensive of them, they belong to them. So the change management side of this, which I don't really get into, I just produce the data and throw it at the consultants, they go and do that stuff. That's the tough stuff. That's really difficult. That's about changing behavior. Let me finish there, and I'll just put up, if you're really interested in more of this, there's a book. And that's the book. And it's a partnership between an academic, myself, who does the research, and a practitioner, a consultant, Melvin J., who does the how-to stuff. Here's the problem. Here's what you can do about it. So I'll stop there and invite questions from you. Thank you very much. Rick.
Curious about Ford because without looking in depth at their financials or anything, my perspective is that of the domestic car companies in the U.S., they were doing the best. So if you could elaborate a little bit.
Yeah, from memory, Ford is one of the most, first at the time of the study, most internationalized. So its international spread was very large. Secondly, it had, at that stage, vertically acquired. So they go through, automotive go through this schizophrenia. They buy out their supply chain. So Ford bought Visteon and then several layers of supply below it. And it differentiated its product and service portfolio by buying out its supply chain. It then, actually 4 years later, divested of it and simplified its pattern. So at the stage we looked at it, it was both international and had gone into a phase where it had acquired a whole range of its suppliers and incorporated the diversity of the supply chain within its organizational structure. And that added to its complexity. It was also struggling. And again, you've got to date some of this because we wanted to look at performance over 5 years. No point in looking at 1 year of performance. It was a 5-year performance trend at least. And those were the two issues relative to its counterparts that at that time seemed to put it into that category. Yeah. The lady over there, I think, because the mic's closest to you.
I'm interested in your perspective, not just as an expert on simplicity, but purely as an academic. I work for a research organization that is rather academic in nature, the Urban Institute, and I frequently work with scholars who are very resistant to simplifying their findings and their insights for a broader audience. What do you find among your colleagues as you make the case for simplicity, and how do you work maybe within that resistance to make findings and research more accessible?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have 240 faculty and staff in a pretty big business school. And academics are the worst types of people, and I am one, so I can say this. And part of the problem is sophistication is part of what they're selling. And there's the dilemma. So poor academics sell sophistication without substance, in my humble opinion. And I think good academics understand the value of the sophistication. So what I mean by that is academics are superly good at methodology, technique, analytical approaches, framing stuff. That's stuff we can do well. It's just that a lot of academics apply it to pretty erudite, irrelevant problems because what they're doing is showing off how clever they are to publish peer-reviewed journal articles. Unfortunately, the promotion, the tenure, gets us promoted on the basis of articles. That world's changing, and business schools are, I think, leading the change. We have to show relevance. We do exec teaching, we do MBAs, we interact and integrate with companies around us. And that, to me, to kind of, I hope, answer your question, is the best indication to academics who are reticent. They either don't want to do it or they can't do it. The best indication is showing them an academic who is superbly well published, an excellent scholar, but is excellent at simplifying the message and putting it in a way that communicates it to an audience that doesn't care about the theory, quite rightly. And I think that exemplar type of scholar, and I have about 5 of them in my faculty, I roll them out at every conference, I put them in front of clients, I get them out there as indicators of the best of both worlds, relevant scholarship, engaged scholarship. There's a longer answer, I don't have time for it, because it's an excellent question, and R&D is like herding cats. It is just the same as academia. It's trying to get people who have creative, sophisticated ideas focused on one outcome. So I sympathize if I don't quite answer the question. Sir, please.
Good morning. Jim McCormick. When you mentioned Apple, you implied that we might be surprised by your characterization that it wasn't one of the more simple. Could you embellish on that?
Yeah, it's portrayed in the management literature as being simple in one clear sense. There is a figure that's used for Apple, I don't know if you're familiar with it, called the smiling curve figure. What Apple has done is cut out a portfolio of things that a lot of companies do. It doesn't make stuff. It does 2 things. It does the R&D and design and the human interface stuff really well. And then at the end of what we call the smiling curve, and it's called the smiling curve because you make more money by being at the 2 ends of the smiling curve. The stuff at the bottom doesn't make you as much money. The other end it does is marketing and branding. It's a fantastic brand company. So it's portrayed as simple because it sticks to that area of the value chain. One end, high-tech inputs and R&D. Other end, brand management and marketing. In the middle is the more hands-on making stuff, components, putting stuff together, and the actual manufacturing. It actually offshores it all, mainly to China and Taiwan. So because it sits at those 2 ends, it's seen as a simple company that focuses on doing those 2 things very well. It came out in the study as complex because actually it puts an enormous amount of investment into a very, very diverse portfolio of R&D and design projects. It's quite diverse in its exploration. So it's highly risky, but that kicked a number of our indexes on these are the proxy measures, on the 9 proxy measures. One was the diversification of its R&D effort, and R&D intensity was one of the other proxy measures. The second thing I think it triggered was M&A. That might be the timing of the study, I'm not sure, but it had gone into acquiring, not in the marketing end, but at the R&D end, a lot of companies to try and supplement its tech, I guess. So that's as close as an explanation I can give you. Yeah. So, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Oh, good. Okay. Your talk reminds me of a book that was written about 20 years ago called Reengineering the Corporation.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with it?
Yeah.
Michael Hammer?
Yeah.
It seems as though, and maybe it was a timing issue, what he was professing to do was a lot of what you're talking about, and it was well received in one regard and absolutely badly received in another way. Can you comment on the relationship between that idea and what you're proposing?
Yeah, and that's a good question. And it was Gary Hamel and Prahalad at London Business School.
Gary
who
Hamel,
initiated it.
right.
Yeah, and they did a lot with Phillips on this. I think, they certainly touched on some of these themes, but their focus was process. So re-engineering, remapping processes and the process approach. One of our categories was process complexity, but actually we started to discover, first of all, manufacturing, TQM, had nailed process. We also saw that process was really subordinate to people's behavior. You put a process in most organizations these days, and it'll work or not work because of the people. And I think they missed that. And if you remember their prognosis, they took a number of companies, very similar to Tom Peters, in search of excellence. And if you look at the companies 10, 15 years after they'd analyzed them, most of them had panned. They weren't doing very well. And quite rightly, it was held up as a management book that said, look, we've got the clue to performance. Turns out 10, 15 years later, they didn't. I'd like to say I'm not really a management guru, and what we did in the quantitative study, where we correlated performance and certain types of complexity, is temporarily figure out which companies were doing really well, temporarily. We did use a 5-year performance time horizon, but we picked out companies for that period of time were doing really well. I have no predictability about whether they're going to do well in the future, because if they don't handle different forms of complexity, they'll go under. What was much more interesting to me was the qualitative study, the survey, the talking to people and understanding what it was that they would do differently in their organizations. And I think Prahlad and Hamel didn't get to that level of analysis in their particular book. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.